Thanks for tuning in to the HR Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Lucinda. The HR Uprising is focused on helping forward-thinking people professionals deliver real lasting value in their organisations. I'm a chartered psychologist, speaker and trainer, and recently authored the best-selling business book, How to Be a Change Superhero. My day job is founder and CEO of software and training business Actus. This gives me the opportunity to work with other businesses like yours. We are focused on building a better workplace for people wherever they are located, with the help of our performance, learning and talent management software and our training and consultancy services. Every week on the podcast, I will be covering different topics and challenges, joined by relevant experts and real-life people professionals. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really hope you enjoy and get value from this week's episode. Hello and welcome to this week's HR Uprising podcast. And today I have a returning guest, and we're both in slight shock to realise that it's actually 5 years and COVID since Aoife O'Brien was on the podcast. And even though it's 5 years ago, I really remember this, and I've followed Aoife on social media ever since and watched her interactions and your work, Aoife. It's really insightful and interesting. And I love the way your Happier at Work podcast has just gone from strength to strength. So if you like her podcast listen, do look that up. She won Business Podcast of the Year and various other accolades with that podcast. I guess, Aoife, just to position you, and I'll let you introduce yourself in a moment, you are a leadership and culture specialist. When we met 5 years ago, you just completed your MSc, because we just both did an MSc in occupational psychology or organisational behaviour, which is different terms, so it's pretty much the same thing. And you were really all about belonging, and we had a really passionate conversation about how important feeling belonging is at work. And during this episode, we'll see how your thinking has moved forwards on that. But quite excitingly, you've just released your debut book, Thriving Talent, by Blue Goat Books, and we'll give the link to this. And I've been watching all of your fabulous launch events, and you were on TV in Ireland, weren't you, I think? So it looks like a really exciting journey. So delighted to have you back, Aoife. We're going to have a general conversation about, your thinking behind the book and top tips for people listening as to how they can really engender a culture or an environment for your talent to thrive. But why don't you introduce a bit of the journey over the last 5 years? People can look up your old episode and tell us a bit more about what you're up to.
Yeah, so it's like press pause, listen back to that other episode, or have a listen to that other episode after this one. Thanks so much for having me back on, Lucinda. It's really great, and I'm really looking forward to this chat. I suppose for me, if I think back, and like we were having a laugh saying how it seems like yesterday, but it also seems like a long time ago. 5 years. Yeah. It's like it's gone in the blink of an eye. So the thinking and how it's evolved since then, I suppose my original prompt for doing the masters in the first place was because of some experiences I had at work, and I wasn't happy, and I asked those difficult questions like, what should I have done differently? What should leaders have done differently? And what should HR have done differently? And I think, and I do talk about this in the book, I didn't know any different. I thought the leadership stuff and the people management is HR's responsibility. And that's probably a big piece of the thinking that has evolved since I've been working with different organisations, that I understand a bit more about the responsibilities that leaders have specifically in relation to creating these environments. Like, it doesn't all fall to HR, which is what I previously thought. When I asked those questions, I looked at it very much from the individual perspective, but also from the organisational perspective. And probably when we spoke the last time, I was focused on individuals. And as an individual, how do we feel a sense of belonging? Or as an organisation, how do we create a sense of belonging? And through my conversations, like, the language has evolved, the thinking on it, even the names. So when I talked about, I'm not even sure if I had a framework when we spoke. I just knew that there were these three things that I called values, needs and strengths. And it's evolved now
I think they're themes almost for you. themes that have
Yeah,
come through your
themes,
research. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. Whereas now it's much more structured, and that's through conversations I've had on the podcast. It's through conversations I've had with leaders in global organizations, and it's from my own research and inspiration as well. And I don't think that the framework itself will necessarily change, but the elements or what is contained within the elements may change and evolve over time, depending on additional research that I do or conversations that I have or challenges, specific challenges in workplaces. But what it looks like is this, and if I can kind of paint a picture
Yes.
for people who are listening today, the foundation, it's like a temple. So we have the foundation of psychological safety, and that's about feeling safe to speak up without any fear of consequences. So you're not worried about what's going to happen if you push back on workload. You're not worried if you're sharing a new idea that people are going to laugh at you, things like that. So we have to have that in place, and the default tends to be that we don't have psychological safety. Then there are three pillars, and again, this is where the kind of the values, needs and strengths, if people have listened to the previous episode, they will find familiar. So it's evolved from values to more generally workplace culture, and what kind of behaviors we have in the workplace and what shapes the culture that we experience on a day-to-day basis. Then the second pillar has gone from needs to drivers. So it's beyond just our universal needs. We're looking at unique drivers that people might have that help them to do their best work, that really get them up in the morning, that really, drive them to behave in a positive way. The additional thing, and I think this came through the process of writing the book, was the idea that there are some things that drive us but actually get in the way. So the one that I always think of, and I can kind of relate to this personally, if it's okay to say, is the idea of a drive to be right all the time. So if you have an inner drive to be right, it may get in the way of you building better relationships or being able to do your best work.
Or perfectionism or something.
Perfectionism.
You could be very critical and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes, yeah. So it's like an inner drive. It's a drive that you have internally to do these things, but it's not really helping you to succeed. The third pillar then has evolved from strengths, what I spoke about before is understanding strengths, to more broadly capabilities. And that's kind of looking from an individual, so understanding individual strengths, but also understanding strengths and complementary strengths within a team, looking at the broader, like how do we make sure that people are using their capabilities, and also understanding what blocks get in the way. So are there things that get in the way of us using our strengths? Is it busy work? Is it too many emails or too many meetings? Things like that. And then the capstone of this temple model is leadership. And again, when I spoke about leadership before, I was probably focused on leading other people without necessarily reflecting on what it takes to lead ourselves first, and understanding how can we be better leaders to ourselves before we think about leading other people.
So what feels like there is you broadened out the concepts to be, maybe for the majority of our audience are, let's say, OD or HR people, to be almost more systems, looking at it from a systems point of view as opposed to a narrow point of view. Although you did talk about the individual element of leadership, so it's not just leaders. It's not just someone else's problem, like you started with HR or lead. It's actually all of our problem is leading ourselves and then otherwise. So it's quite broad, isn't it?
Yeah. I feel like it's broad and it encapsulates everything. And some people have described it. I was a bit offended when she described it as an encyclopedia. Someone else described it as a Bible. I was like, okay, so it's like a go-to thing. If you need an answer to a question about leadership, about culture, about workplace engagement, you can probably find the answer in this book. The way I like to think about it is I've gone very broad, but I've gone very deep in each of those very specific areas.
So you can really get the depth of the answer as to diagnosing that specific area. Do you know what's in my head at the moment? You might know this, Aoife, this model. I'm sure you do. I was just thinking about the Burke-Litwin OD model. I've got my visual, because I know yours is kind of a temple. The way I've seen the Burke-Litwin, it's, sorry, users, listeners, if this sounds a bit jargony, I actually have got a download to this if you wanted to see it. But what it does is it shows about sort of organizational performance, and it's the model of how these things all work together. And it's quite similar to what you're describing, Aoife, in some ways. My visual is similar. So you're kind of going in underneath these, but the template you're talking about here, your foundation in your book, is sort of more all encompassing. It's probably less complex to visualize. So it's a
Okay,
nice
yeah.
model to
I
visualize,
don't know
right?
that one, but I must, after this call, I must look it
I'll
up.
send you a screenshot and I'll put a
Yeah.
link in the notes. I remember I went on an OD course at Ruffy Park years and years ago, and it just stuck with me as quite a good model. And so
Yeah.
I'll send it over and I'll put it in the show notes for anyone who's interested. But the reason I raised that is that I've used that as a diagnostic tool in an organization where you're thinking, okay, something's not working. Let's say performance isn't working. Let's look at all these things that feed into each other. So the systems and processes, or the leadership, as you say, or the culture, or whatever those things might be. And that's basically what you're describing here. Is you've got a handbook that we don't always we know there's a problem, but that's giving you a toolkit of things that you could go in and get underneath that problem, and ideally come up with some ideas or solutions that you could test out as to how to improve it. I'm
This is it.
inferring.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I wanted to make it very practical. And I think, one of the things, and I don't know, did you find this as well, Lucinda? Like when I was doing my master's, I found a lot of the articles that we had access to quite inaccessible from a language perspective because it's very academic and you wouldn't give that to a leader. But I wanted to also find a way of how do we take all of this amazing research that's being done and give it to leaders in a way that they're actually going to find it really useful, as
Absolutely.
opposed to sending them to something that is academic, jargony, and really hard to translate into something that's really practical. I think academics do a fantastic job, but if you haven't been in the environment of business, it's quite hard to translate what does that actually look like. I had a 20-year corporate career before I set up my own business, so I'm coming at it from that perspective of these are the problems that I have directly experienced at work, and I had so many stories to draw upon, which was great because it really brings it to life for people if they can see themselves in, like, oh, that actually happened to me, or I remember that from earlier in my
Yeah.
career, or things like that. So in some ways, I did want to have that, like, how do we make this practical for people to
Absolutely,
be
because
able to
pure theory
implement
is
stuff.
just yeah. But so this is an accessible handbook for practitioners, isn't it? It's really
Yeah.
interesting. This reminds me, I think, is why we really connected last time when we spoke. And for the listeners, so I was just mentioned off camera. So Professor Rob Breener was in one of our first 6 episodes, and many of you will have seen him on social media. He actually was my professor when I did my masters, and he is very much all about evidence-based management and that sort of side of things. But he's really very much out there as being almost the contrarian in terms of. So we'll come on to this about psychological safety. We'll pick this up because I think he puts things like, what's the problem with psychological safety, or what's the problem with engagement? Now, don't get me wrong, he absolutely does agree that there's lots of evidence of it, but what he doesn't like is people totally getting on a bandwagon and thinking that things are the panacea, and also starting with psychological safety and saying this is the solution to everything. He's very much about, you've got to understand what the problem is first to
Yeah.
be evidence based. However, I did ask this to him on August because I was like, but when you're a practitioner, you also need to be pragmatic. You don't
Yeah.
always have an evidence. You can't do a longitudinal study when you've just walked in and into a project in a business and some
Yeah.
problems, you've got to go, "Oh, let's make an educated guess and look at what the solutions can be." So
That's
maybe
such
this
a
is
good
middle
point,
ground.
actually. Yeah, yeah. Or you can't
So
wait for the results of a survey if
no,
it's
I
going to
mean,
be 3 weeks and you need to implement something straight away. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, obviously that would make sense to make sure you are tracking and seeing if it works and then review. That's
Yeah.
practical evidence based, I'd say. But that's again the sort of thing that your book could be useful because you've done deep dives into these topics and can give people tools, etc. on them. So why don't we touch on just a few of the highlights of each of the blocks of
Yeah.
our house, and let's start with psychological safety. As I say, that was the one
Yeah.
that well done for getting the endorsement from Amy Edmondson, and I think the CIPD certainly validated psychological safety. So there's definitely evidence out there, although we're not saying it's the panacea. What's
Yeah.
your take on that in this context, if people want
So
to consider it?
yeah, and obviously I drew upon a lot of research that Amy Edmondson had done, and she talks about failure and feeling safe to failure, and three types of failure, and it's okay to fail, but it's about learning. It's not just about, like, we can't fail and not learn from, take the learning from the failure. It's so important to do that. She herself will say that people confuse psychological safety and saying it's the answer to everything, but actually no, it's the means to the end. It's creating psychological safety so that, and whatever that is, that's each individual organization needs to understand. Is it to improve performance? Is it to look at engagement? And again, when we look at performance and engagement, those are what I've heard this term from Zach Mercurio, the lagging indicators, and what you need to understand are the leading indicators.
Yes.
What are the things that come before those things? But bringing it back to psychological safety,
Sorry,
I
did you
think
say that engagement is a lagging indicator?
yes, yeah.
Oh wow, because
Because
we always used
it's
to
what
talk
happens
about,
after. Yeah,
because I used to I always understood the balance sheet to be a lagging indicator of engagement. So it's like what comes even before it. So we are trying to get to the
yeah.
root of things. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, it's how people feel about their work. So engagement is looking into the past, if you like how engaged were you today or this past week or this month. But if you think in the moment, what is causing me to feel this specific way about work, that's what the leading indicator would be. So it's whether you feel supported in your role, whether you feel like your work actually matters, whether it's important. Those kinds of things will
And those are
lead
the
to
questions, aren't
a
they?
sense of
Engagement survey.
engagement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So coming back to psychological safety then, so what Amy Edmondson talks about is that we kind of have this default that we don't have psychological safety. We assume that we have it because people are silent, but when people are silent, it's a clear sign that we have not created psychological safety. The thing that people get wrong often with psychological safety, and there's two extremes. So one extreme is that everyone is really nice here and it's really comfortable and there's no conflict, therefore we have psychological safety. That's incorrect, because if everything is nice and comfortable, then we don't have psychological safety. The other extreme is we have psychological safety, therefore I can say and do what I want without any consequences. And it kind of it's licensed to say what's really on your mind, which is also not psychological safety. So we have to show a level of candor. So it's speaking up, but strategically. It's not just licensed to say whatever you want to say. What it really is being able to speak up and share what's on your mind, but you're speaking up without any fear that there's going to be repercussions, that people are not going to laugh at you, that you're not going to be held back. Like, this is a big thing. I think people feel like this is going to have implications. If I speak up to my boss, then he's going to think I'm not capable of doing my job, or I'm going to not be put forward for the next promotion opportunity or whatever. We are so afraid because we have to speak up to people who have a direct influence on our career, essentially how much money we make, how successful we are, all of those kinds of things. We need to create an environment where it's okay to do this, because that's how we create an environment of learning. It's how we learn from each other. It's how we can learn from mistakes. It's how we can innovate in our organizations. And I think especially in this day of AI, we need to be able to experiment. We need to be able to innovate.
And challenge.
And challenge how things are doing.
Yeah,
challenge
absolutely.
processes, challenge the status quo. Like, one example that I share in the book, when I joined a new organization, one of my colleagues, now she wasn't even a manager of mine, but I had an example that I wanted to share. I was bringing an idea of something that I had done in a previous organization, and she turned to me and she said, "That's not how we do things around here."
Oh,
And yeah,
culture.
I was like, "Oh, okay." So that was kind of a quick learning for me of, it's not safe to speak up here, even with my peers. It's not safe to share ideas. And how many more ideas do you think I spoke up with and shared as a result of that happening? I was very reluctant. I was very
cautious.
I was really treading carefully. I was really cautious. Exactly. Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
that very much correlates as well. I did a webinar recently on building successful teams, and if you look at the team models, whether people like them or not, but very old, you've got Tuckman and you've got the Five Dysfunctions of a Team, the book by Lencioni. Both of those refer to an absence of conflict being a problem, or storming phase. You need to get to actually get to a point of performance, and that is about the building
Yeah.
trust and being safe to have conflict, healthy conflict, constructive conflict is part of the
Yes.
journey to getting to that point of being a successful team, which I guess is a state of psychological safety, because those words have not been, those models predate, the Amy Edmondson
Yeah.
work.
So it's the same kind of concept, but it's just different language that they're using, it sounds like.
Absolutely. Yeah. So psychological safety, that's our foundation. We need to have that there. It's very hard to have the areas to build on otherwise. You touched on
Yes.
that's not how we do things around here, where that your instance there, which is a great segue into culture, isn't it? I'm going to
Yeah.
talk a
Yeah.
little bit
Yeah.
about work that makes culture in your three pillars.
Yeah. So, workplace culture, I look at the things that make up culture and the influence that leaders have specifically. And for me, the basis of that has always been values. And if we think about this from a few different perspectives, so if we think about what a company says they stand for, what's on the wall, what's in the emails, what do we talk about in town halls, it's what they say versus how they behave. Is there a match or a mismatch between those things? And if I think again about a previous organization I worked in, they talked about this idea of simple as being one of our values, but it was the most bureaucratic organization I had ever worked in. And so for me, that's an instant mismatch. And I probably didn't have the language at the time, but when I look back now with this new lens, I understand that that was a total mismatch. Simple on the one hand, but very bureaucratic in the processes and the procedures. And the other way we can look at it is a mismatch between the behaviors that you see around you and the behaviors that you would expect, the norms and the behaviors that you have as an individual. And maybe another example of this is in a different organization I worked in, I was told several times, you're going to be promoted. I was asked what kind of director I would like to be, and I thought, fantastic, this is really happening. I'm being recognized, rewarded for the work that I'm doing. And then it never happened. So for me, it's kind of a couple of things it touches on. I think the idea of transparency and really valuing people being transparent, but also what I term commitment. So if you say you're going to do something, you need to do it. And when I didn't see those behaviors again, it just really, it really bothered me enough to end up leaving that organization because I
Yeah.
didn't see,
Because it's a jarring,
it
it's a
was,
lack of alignment, isn't it? And how
yeah,
can you, and you might join, it's interesting you link that into why people join and leave companies and the whole thing about employer brand. Because if you're attracted to the values that are promoted to you in interview, and as soon
yes,
as you get in there, there's no alignment with it, that's
yeah,
that's just
yeah.
not going to work, is it?
Exactly, yeah. And I do touch on the different types of toxic cultures. One of those is the one that says that has this fantastic employer brand, they've won awards, and then you enter and it's nothing like you expected. You're
Yeah.
thinking, wow, award winning for culture, it must be amazing. You get in there and you're like, this it does not live up to
Yeah.
expectation. It's all about that kind of external marketing, the employer brand. So yeah, I do touch on that, and then how to recover from, because I don't think we set out to create a toxic work environment. It just accidentally happens. But what can we do to specifically address when we
What would
find
be another,
ourselves?
if you're going to give us one or two just highlights of something, what sort of things could people do in that situation?
I think for me, it's first of all, it's calling out the elephant in the room. It's saying, listen, we have created this toxic culture. It was unintentional, and here are some things to do about it. I think getting buy in from people, involving them in decisions, involving them in change, I think is a really important thing. It's not coming from the top, it's being acknowledged from the top that this is what's happened. And dare I say, but oftentimes, it takes a new person joining an organization to
Almost a
really
catalyst,
implement that
maybe.
change. It's
Yeah.
the catalyst because they have this external perspective and they see what's going on. And if they're brave enough, then they can call that out and try and make the change and explain to leaders in language that they'll understand. So in monetary terms, in the how much it's costing them in terms of retention or people leaving, costing attrition, but also how much it's costing them in terms of performance, because people are not performing at their best if they're in this toxic environment. So I think it's important that, we have the leaders in place, but we get the buy-in from the team that this change is going to happen. Some people may opt to leave that situation. So things were working very much in their favour in that toxic environment. They were being recognised or they were being rewarded in some way, and they may opt to leave. And I think that's fine, because you don't want the people who thrived in that toxic environment to stay.
Yeah, that's part of the change. You do need that to move over, for sure. So then let's move into the next one is drives, isn't it? Drives and
drivers,
capabilities.
drivers.
Yeah.
So drivers is looking at, we have universal needs for autonomy, relatedness and competence. And I'm sure we touched on that in the previous episode, so I won't dwell on it too longer. We also have unique needs that each individual person would have. So it could be a need for serving a higher purpose. It could be a need for a variety in your role, or stability, or security in your role as well. I know it's not
those are like
easy to get
values.
security.
Would they be
They're
personal? How are you
more
measuring
personal
those?
needs. So thinking about, you can think about it like this, like what really frustrates you at work right now. And the one I always think about, and again, this may be how my thinking has evolved on this as well, is it's not just about satisfying the need, it's about finding that perfect balance. So if you think of autonomy, at the one end, you have a lack of autonomy, which is micromanagement. But at the other end, the other extreme, you have a lack of guidance or a lack of direction. And then you could be floundering because you don't know what you're supposed to be working on. You spend a lot of energy trying to figure all of that out. So it's about finding that kind of unique balance. And the difficulty here is that each individual person will have a different level of that. You will have different levels throughout your career. So if you're starting in a new role, you might need more guidance and less autonomy. As your career progresses, you would imagine you would have more autonomy, but maybe you need more guidance. Like, it's about finding that balance all the time.
And the level of support that individual needs. So that's about the connectivity between the line manager, the manager, and the individual, understanding what their requirement is and being able to flex fundamentally.
What actually motivates you, like what gets you out of bed in the morning? And if I think of some personal examples for me, it's having really clear guidance and really clear expectations that really helps me to do a better job. But then being recognised, I don't need more money. I just need someone to say, when you did that, that was, and being really specific about the impact that the work I did, that really motivates me. It makes me want to do more of that same thing.
That's basically
get more of that recognition.
That's spot on definition, isn't it, of where there's lots of research about really clear goals and good quality feedback. It is a motivated high performance, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's interesting, the autonomy one. I can think why I left the business I left before I set up on my own, and that was because I had a change in management. And I was thinking it was kind of compromised my value of freedom, but basically it's autonomy, which is pretty much the same thing, thinking about it. So I'd gone from having a lot of freedom within a role to having a new line manager who kind of, I felt like they, I was in quite a senior role, but they basically were micromanaging. And I was like, I felt suffocated. So it's interesting, isn't it?
It happens, and it's really hard to have that conversation, I think, if you are being micromanaged, and it does happen at senior levels as well, trying to explain to someone, this is not how I do my best work. And but I think from their perspective, it often stems from insecurity. So maybe they feel like they're in over their head, and they need to have their fingers in everything. They need to know what's, everything that's going on to justify the role that they have. But coming back to this idea of drivers, there are some things that can drive us in a way that holds us back as well. So thinking of things like we talked about perfectionism, so that might get in the way of us doing an effective job, because we spend way too much time trying to perfect something when actually we need to just move on to the next thing. So there are these inner drives that we have that can get in the way of us
and actually having a really
work.
Strong need for, let's say, freedom. That example, I mean, the organisation I was in, if you're in a really heavily regulated process-oriented organisation, that's probably not for you. So it's about finding the right fit for your drivers too, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
Which again goes back to recruiting people with the right values and for that right organisation, and making sure you're prescribed values of an organisation do align with what you really expect from people. And does
Exactly.
that flow then into capabilities? Because there's kind of the drivers will link to capabilities, I guess, because your
They're
motivation
linked in
or
some way, but I've looked at them in as kind of quite distinct things. When I started looking at capabilities, and this is probably when I was starting writing the book as well, I was focused very much on individual strengths. But as my learning developed, it was looking at it's not just about strengths and knowing strengths, although that's definitely not something that we speak about an awful lot at work. And we need to speak more about what people's strengths and capabilities are. It's looking broader context and seeing, okay, so if we have this team, who on the team needs to work together because they have complementary strengths. So I might be very good at the detail and the analysis, but we have someone else who's good at building relationships or seeing that bigger picture. Well, those two people need to work together because the sum is going to be greater than the individual
yes,
parts.
yeah,
But those people may also antagonize each other because they can't really see the perspective that each other is coming from. So I think creating the kind of environment for both of those to contribute and to see the strengths in each other is really important. In the
back to your
capability
psychological
section,
safety to have differences and you know embrace
yes.
differences. Yes.
Yeah, and I think that positive conflict that you touched on earlier as well, Lucinda. And then on the if we think about like from an organizational perspective, I don't want to dwell on this for too long, but thinking about how are people learning at work and how do we leverage AI to make sure that people are free to use their unique human capabilities and we can get AI to do some of the more administrative heavy work, the repetitive kind of things as well. And then thinking of, well, what gets in the way? What are the things that block us from doing our best work? So meetings, busy work, all of those kinds of things. So how do we actually address those to clear up space for getting into flow, for doing that deep work and carving out time to be able to do that? And then we have leadership. So looking at ourselves and looking at how we lead other people.
So that's your flow through in terms of you're looking at leadership not as out there leaders. It's starting about how do you lead yourself, understand yourself, and I suppose that would also build on your point about capabilities and differences because being
Yes.
aware of where your strengths and blind spots are and how that might mean that you get on well or not with other people is.
Yeah.
Do you advocate for any kind of tools or anything like that to understand individual differences, or is it just broadly I'm not sure if you do in the book or just broadly?
I don't not well. There are some recommendations in terms of understanding strengths. So things that have worked particularly well for me. There are tools that are available online for free. There are other paid tools as well. So one that I used years and years ago was the Gallup one. It was called Strengths Finder. Then is it Clifton Strengths now? Maybe it's. I feel like it was one thing and now it's changed to another. But yeah, I have the book on that, and it's something I refer back to.
Your top 10 strength.
Yeah.
Identify top 10, or you had to pay money to them to do the full on one. Yes.
Yeah, but if I, and there's free ones as well. And if I take kind of I can take bits and pieces from all of those that make sense to me. If I think about my career, if I think about what I was good at school, if I think about what people ask me about and what people ask me for, and make the link to that to say, okay, so this is what I'm really good at. So that's kind of how I use that. But in terms of individual differences specifically, I haven't looked at that.
No, just curiosity. So then moving on, let's close down with our leadership piece. So starting with sort of personal leadership, what does that look like? And then where do you go from there?
Yeah, so for me, it's about self-awareness. And I touch on this again in the book. I read another fantastic book called Insight by Dr. Tasha Eurich. I don't know if you've read that, but for me, it's all about self-awareness, but understanding ourselves through feedback, through like being open and with an understanding that we are less self-aware than we think we are. I think, again, I had my launch at Google last week and this topic came up and I asked the room how many people here think they're self-aware, and you bet 99% of people in the room put their hand up. And her stats say it's closer to 15% of people are actually self-aware. And so we want to be more self-aware. We think we're more self-aware, but we don't necessarily understand ourselves, what's triggering our emotions, what's triggering our behaviors, and the impact that we have on other people. So for me, that's always the best place to start, is understand what's going on internally for yourself. Like what you're saying, if someone particularly on your team antagonizes you, what's driving that, and how, beyond just knowing that, how do we manage ourselves? If we're having a specific reaction, how do we respond rather than have that kind of intense emotional reaction as well? So to me, it's always important to kind of start from there.
For our listeners, who let's assume would be the same as the people in the room at Google or say that 95% of us think we're self-aware, but actually 80% of us are wrong, according to this person's research. What questions would we ask ourselves to kind of explore whether we were or weren't? How did she determine that people are not self-aware when they think they are?
That's a good question, and I can't remember specific details from the book. I think for me, it's there, and she talks about this, is the difference between, say, the impact that you are having on yourself, or like the internal thing that's going on, but also and being in reflection. So we can say, I'm really self-aware because I journal every day and I'm writing things out, and I know what's going on for me internally. I can process stuff, and I can understand my emotions, and I can understand what's happening. But you can be like that, but you can also at the same time have no idea the impact that you're having on other people. So it's both in tandem. We need to understand the impact that we're having on others. And I think understanding ourselves and maybe doing a self-reflection piece, if you're going through a tough time, if you're having a specific emotional thing, that's probably the thing that causes us to want to explore what's going on here. And instead of, I probably have a default to look to blame other people. So instead of thinking, what did they do wrong? Look inside yourself. What role did I have to play within this?
Take responsibility
Take responsibility. But then also, if you're thinking about the impact that you have on other people, maybe watch for those emotional cues. Ask for specific feedback if you're not getting feedback about that. I think feedback is really necessary. It's really difficult, but it's really necessary in order for us to be able to grow. So if we're not getting regular feedback, and not just the nice positive feedback about how great a job we're doing, we need that other like developmental feedback to grow. So I think asking other people to provide feedback without that fear of repercussion, without like, it's not going to cost you your job, it's not going to cost you any, there's not going to be negative consequences. I need this feedback in order to help me to grow, because like you touched on earlier, Lucinda, like we all have blind spots. We have no idea that this is impacting either us or other people.
So there's loads of stuff we could dig into further there, and that's real food for thought. Could you just say the name of that book again, because I might have to look that up, and who the author was? And
it's Insight by Dr. Tasha Eurich.
Eurich, spelled with a Y?
No, spelled Eurich. Eurich.
Okay, right, interesting. I'm going to look that one up. Oh, but we could carry on for ages, Aoife, but I don't think we have time. And there's plenty of ways in which people can find out more. They can buy your book, which is available in all good bookshops and on Amazon, etc., etc. So do go out and do that. To say, it's a really it's been a real journey, I think, hasn't it? And it sounds fascinating as something that's really practical and useful for our listeners that I guess want to maybe just do something differently next week on Monday that would be in line with this, that would be a takeaway that would be practical. Let's close on something that you say is a key takeaway that's practical that people could do.
I think, so for me, because the foundation is psychological safety, and because most teams don't have psychological safety, I think something you could do is test for whether you have it or not. Now, there are a few different ways to do it. You can ask for something, and if people are silent, if they don't speak up, then you very likely don't have psychological safety. One example that was used on my podcast, and that I've used it in the book as well, is asking people to do something outrageous, like it's way out of budget, the deadline is ridiculous, like something that they will definitely not be able to do. Ask them to do that and see what they say. And again, if they're silent, if they're not speaking up, if they're not pushing back on that, then you probably don't have psychological safety. And if you don't have psychological safety, again, for me, it's about calling out the elephant in the room. I've learned about this thing called psychological safety. I want to bring more psychological safety into the team. Do you think we have it? How do you think we can build it? And in the book, there are some very specific things that people can do. But one of the big things that I think we don't talk about an awful lot at work is caring. Like, show that you genuinely care for other people, their well-being, their career, and I think just making work a really positive place to be, because I think we sometimes fall into the trap that work should be work and it's drudgery and all of that kind of thing. But I think work can actually be something that's really fulfilling for us.
That's a lovely place to end, isn't it? And I think this tie into your thing that actually speaking up and not agreeing is part of how we make work better and
exactly.
And improve things. Aoife, always brilliant to have you on. It's lovely to have you on for a second time. I've been staying in contact with you. I do encourage people to follow Aoife on LinkedIn if you don't already. I'll put all of these in the show notes. Your book, thrivingtalentbook.com.
thrivingtalentbook.com. Yeah, that's the best. Yeah, you'll find out all of the links to buy the book there.
Great. And any other ways in which you'd like to direct people if they want to know more about what you do?
I suppose for me, 3 places. The podcast, Happier at Work. You're listening to a podcast now, so go and check out Happier at Work podcast, wherever you're getting your podcast. The book, thrivingtalentbook.com, and LinkedIn, as you mentioned already. So if we put the link down there, I always have to spell my name out for people. So it's Aoife O'Brien, but it's spelled Aoife. So if anyone wants to search
the joys of Irish
LinkedIn,
names.
The joys of Irish names. Exactly.
Wonderful. Well, great to have you on the podcast. And I wish you loads of success with your book sales.
Likewise. Thank you so much. Really, really enjoyed being back. Thanks so much for having me back, Lucinda.
I really hope you found this week's episode useful and enjoyable. If you did, perhaps you could recommend us to a friend or colleague, or give us a review on your platform of choice. It really helps new listeners to find us. Now you can access links to any of the information mentioned in this show via the website www.hruprising.com. Further free resources are also available at www.actus.co.uk. There you can also find out more about our software and training solutions. Finally, why not join our LinkedIn group, the HR Uprising, to share ideas and collaborate with other like-minded people professionals. Thank you for listening to the HR Uprising podcast.
This episode was brought to you by Disruptive Media, helping bold entrepreneurs stand out through podcasting, video, and social content. Visit disruptivemedia.co.uk to learn more.